It's Alessandro from Innovate With Impact, hashtag small relief. I'm super excited to be here today with Elvin Turner. Hey, Elvin.
Hey.
Elvin wrote a really cool book called Be Less Zombie, which I can only highly recommend, but we'll get to talk about that in just a second. Before we get started, Elvin, please quickly introduce yourself.
Great. Thanks, Alessandro, for having me on. So my name is Elvin Turner. I do a couple of different things. Most of my time is spent working, it's usually with large organizations, helping them figure out what comes next. How do we bring more of tomorrow into today? How do we create a culture where innovation can truly show up and people can do their best work? So there's a lot of consultancy. I do teaching as well on MBA programs and entrepreneurship programs. So it's a nice mix between, I guess, 90% practical, hands-on work and 10% writing and teaching.
That sounds amazing. So if you don't mind, telling us a little bit more about how did you get into all of this and what motivated you writing this book? I mean, there's obviously a lot to be said about it.
Yeah, well, I guess, the two come together, really. I spent quite a few years heading up an innovation practice inside another organization. And then 3 or 4 years ago, I started up on my own. But almost every client project that I found myself going into, I would walk away at the end of the project feeling, I wish there was something I could leave behind, something that was really practical and like a handbook on how to do more of what we're talking about. And well, you can see behind me, I read a lot. That's a small fraction of my books. I'm in a new office at the moment, but there are so many great books out there on innovation and entrepreneurship. And yet I didn't feel that any of them were quite the right thing to hand over, especially to people who are working in innovation entrepreneurship for the first time. Getting through some of the theory and just give me the stuff, give me the tools, give me the ABC. Which I push back against a little bit, because that shortcut mentality I don't think is actually very helpful. But I felt there's a gap here for something that I can hand to people so that they can genuinely make progress, not just in the process of innovation, but how do you do strategy for innovation? How do you do the process? How do you do culture? How do you do leadership? How does this whole thing come together in a way that you can just switch on? So that was really the motivation of the book. I never actually intended to write a book until I met this guy who was a professor in a business school, and he wanted my help with a session he was running. So I went to meet him. The first words out of his mouth were, "So what are you writing?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, which book are you working on?" I said, "Well, I'm not. It's like everyone's writing a book." And he said, "Well, you should be." I thought, well, this is very interesting first meeting. Anyway, what he went on to say was what really caught my attention. He says, "Listen, 2 reasons to write a book. First one is the phone starts ringing." And I kind of knew that, it's a business calling card, but that wasn't never a strong enough motivation for me to do it. But the second thing he said was, it will force you to simplify and improve what you believe. And what will happen is you'll write the book, the phone will ring, and you'll hear this voice at the other end of the line saying, "I'm really sorry, it's such short notice, but could you come and speak at this conference next week?" And you say yes. And then you turn up at the conference with no preparation, and it just flows out of you. And I thought, now I like the sound of that. That's really helpful, less preparation time. So I wrote the book, and would you believe, 2 weeks before the end of writing the book, the phone rings twice, 2 people saying, "Oh no, it's really short notice. Could you come and speak at these conferences?" And I said, I need to try this thing out. I've got nothing to lose. Let's go for it. So I did no prep, 30 minutes for one. And he was right. And I stood up and it all, it flowed. So I never intended to do it, but I'm really pleased that I did. And the feedback that I'm getting so far is really encouraging me to think, actually, I'd like to do more of this. So that's kind of how it was born.
Well, I'm definitely very grateful to that person, because otherwise I would have probably never met you. So
Yeah.
even for that alone, it's already pretty cool. So, maybe let's, if you don't mind, dive a little bit deeper into the title. How did that come about? I mean, it's obviously a very catchy title, but, obviously must come from the experience that you have seen, but what was the motivator there?
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of fun, to be honest, to begin with. I used to do quite a lot of work with one of the business schools in the UK, Henley Business School, and they wanted me to run a session on innovation, and they kind of had me in what they called their edge bracket. So there's a lot of conventional stuff. I was supposed to come and bring something edgy. So I had to come with an angle, and unicorns at the time were, interesting to talk about, unicorns being organizations that are worth over $1 billion in theory.
Mhm.
So we came up with this idea, this title, Unicorns versus Zombies. Zombies being the living dead, just looking for the next meal. And really, it was about organizations that, excuse me, I was bumping into a lot, which were running on empty, looking in the big idea cupboard, very little in there, and a general sense of frustration and a paradox, really. Executives saying to me, where are all the big ideas? Why aren't they showing up? And yet, when you look behind the scenes, you see an organization that is really only calibrated to deliver more of today. It's the innovator's dilemma, wherever you look. So the zombie organization really is one that is using yesterday's ways of working to try and get into the future, and not really having an environment in which new ideas really can come forward. And their relevance is questionable. It's not an inevitability that they'll show up tomorrow. So that's where it was born. So I started, and then I thought, wow, okay, this guy's telling me I should write a book. Let's just see what happens with this title. And I did my own MVP, minimum viable product. And I thought, and to make myself write the book, because I know what I'm like, I have a million ideas and I chase them all. I put a terrible cover on LinkedIn and said, I'm writing a book. It's called Be Less Zombie. It's out in 6 months. And I thought, now I've really got to do it. So I was holding myself to account. And then the feedback was phenomenal about the title. So I thought, okay, people are going for this. And then I got a book deal, and the rest is history. But I did have a big wobble halfway through, because I was thinking, hang on a minute. Who wants to buy a book where you're kind of admitting that you're a zombie, or at least part zombie? And I was trying to convince the publisher that, no, let's change the title. And they said, no, it's going to be big in America. They're going to love it. So we have the title, but that's where it came from. It's almost every organization that I was working with, I was seeing what I'm calling these zombie dynamics. And I bumped into a guy recently who wrote a book, and we were just chatting about what we were writing about. And he said, why are you bothering to write a book for big companies? They're all dead. There's no point. It's too much effort. And I know where he's coming from, but at the same time, I like to, maybe I'm an eternal optimist, but I like to think actually change is possible.
Mhm.
There are tools you can give people. And at least, even if you help an organization make a 10%, 20% improvement, whether or not you care that much about that organization, I actually care deeply about the people
Mhm.
in those organizations. And if you can make their life better, so much the better. And, one fact that came up when I was doing my research for the book that was actually about the individuals in organizations was, in America, they say now that 1 in 5 people, the cause of death is simply going to work.
Mhm.
And the stress and the secondary diseases that come from that stress. I'm thinking, this is just terrible. And so much of it is unnecessary.
Mhm.
So there are the kind of these dual ideas around the zombie organization, and actually people going to work every day feeling like zombies. I'd sit in meetings with people just exhausted and demoralized, and for ridiculous reasons about the way that the organization chooses to value and measure and pursue value creation in ways that are really not very life-giving. So we'll see whether people really connect with the word zombie. I think it's probably a bit, in England we call it Marmite, which is a food that you either love or hate.
Mhm.
And I think some people seem to really like it. Others are like, what's this zombie thing? That can't be a serious book. Well, actually it really is.
Well, I mean, at the very least, it's a catchy title. And when you start reading the book, you realize there is much more behind it, which is what I really appreciated. So it caught my attention, and I was like, okay, I have to read this. And obviously, I was not at all disappointed, which is also why, I asked you for this interview, because there was so much value in this book. And
Good.
I can only recommend to anybody out there to read it. It has a lot of substance, and it has a lot of really interesting messages in it. Maybe this will lead me to my next question. From your experience, obviously we're going through a tremendously difficult time. A lot of organizations are struggling. So what have you observed over these past months, and how are organizations reacting to it, and how are you helping them?
It's been really interesting, I guess, in my space. So I work in the areas of consulting around innovation, but also learning and development and training, both at MBA and executive level. And if you look at budgets that are shut down fastest, often during recession, it's innovation, it's advertising and training. They hit the floor very fast. So, being really honest, I was looking at that thinking, well, one, was this the dumbest time ever to launch a business book? I don't think it was, actually, because I think what I'm writing about is absolutely what people need to hear. So you could say it's the perfect timing. But looking around my clients and seeing if ever there was a time where we needed more innovation, it's now. And yet the rug has just been pulled from under our feet, at least regarding resources. So I've been seeing that going on. I'm starting to see some of that coming, but 3 months later, things are starting to come back more online. The original wobbles that people were having, it depends on industry, but certainly things are coming back online. And I guess, I love, Alessandra, the fact that you're doing this podcast really as a gesture to try and help in this season. And I guess I found myself looking at my portfolio of work. Some of it disappeared, some of it went online with, like lots of people. And I'm very grateful for a particular project that's, helped me through from a cash flow point of view. It's been really good. But from, taking a step back, thinking, why did I write the book? I wrote the book because I really want people to make better progress in their jobs and with their organizations. That was the sole motivation behind it. And now people aren't even able to engage with that stuff. So my response was, well, okay, the book might have to go on hold, at least in terms of sales for now. What else can I do? So I've created this course. Actually, perhaps we can put it in the notes. It's called Innovation Essentials. It's 30 videos where I'm giving away actually a lot of the stuff that I normally do in my consulting work at a certain level that's connected to the book, which is how to help people do this stuff. So even if you don't have access to training budgets, at least you can put this stuff in front of people and help them have some skills where they can start to do more of the stuff that we're talking about in the book, which is turning great ideas into action. So it's mixed. I mean, I'm seeing organizations now, their appetite to want to innovate is coming back more, but it's still really, it seems to fall into two camps. One is keep the lights on, keep this thing moving. And I noticed you had Alex Osterwalder on a couple of weeks ago. And I would imagine people are flooding to his stuff around business model generation and design and innovation, because what a time to look at, weak signals coming from the future. What does this all mean? How do we stay alive? But also, what experiments can we run now? I mean, you look at the last great recession, we had WhatsApp was born, Instagram was born, Pinterest was born, Slack was born. In amongst all this, when the dust settles after this earthquake, there will be brand new companies being born. So I guess what I'm saying to companies is, yes, stay alive, but put some focus on what is coming so that you can realign parts of your business, because you might be the next unicorn. Don't be a zombie. You never know, what's coming. So I guess, asking those three questions. What's happening? What does it mean? What should we do? And keeping that as a narrative. I'm starting to see people gravitate back more to that way of thinking and stepping slightly out of crisis mode.
It's very interesting for me to see or listen to what you're saying, because I am putting your work in at least a similar category, in a sense that I can only imagine that people are, because of your work, also coming to you now because they need to figure out what's next, right? Or how do you experience that?
Well, I think it's two levels. One is survival right now. What do we need to do to stay alive? But the second one really is, and this is, people are saying to me, someone said to me yesterday, now that COVID's happened, would you have written the book any differently? And actually I wouldn't have done, because what the book is really talking about is creating like an operating system inside your organization, so that it doesn't matter what's going on, you have this innovation instinct, innovation capability that's deeply embedded, that allows you to continually be delivering today whilst designing tomorrow. And so many organizations don't have that discipline. They are so overwhelmed with the busyness of today that they're actually robbing themselves of what comes, in the future. So I guess that the key thing that I'm encouraging companies to do is to really be more strategic about how innovation shows up. And that always starts at the top. I mean, it has to, it's bottom up and top down. But usually I see the turning point come when a group of leaders recognize they're far too involved in the day-to-day business. Our job is to design strategy, to at least orchestrate the design of strategy, and spend a lot more time in the future, pull more of tomorrow into today. Because if we're not doing it, you can rest assured that no one else is, because they're too busy. And for me, that's the a really healthy sign of a leadership team stewarding the business well. It's not allowing themselves just to stay in their comfort zone, because usually when you help a leadership team step back out of that, it's not much fun to begin with. And some of that is because leaders actually have never really had to do a lot of strategic thinking, which might sound strange to some people listening to this. I go into many organizations and I say, right, let's start with your strategy. They don't really have a strategy. They've got a plan that's sort of dressed up as a strategy, but there's nothing really in there about, how to, where to play, how to win, what's going to differentiate us really in the future, and what are we doing to create strategic competitive advantage. It's generally very tactical. So to have to finally step into that and make that a much bigger part of who you are and what you do can be uncomfortable. So it often starts there, but then when you can encourage a team to do that and then begin to empower an organization that has the capabilities and the resources and everything else that we need behind it to deliver sustainable innovation, you've got a much better chance of it showing up on an ongoing basis.
Well, what you're saying is so extremely interesting in a sense also that, when I started, I was thinking about, I didn't really think much, to be honest with you, about starting this interview session. I was just like, I'm just going to get started because I wanted to move into action and I want to start helping people. I'm like, whatever it's going to take, even if I'm going to make mistakes and failures, I'll learn from them and I just we'll keep moving. And so I ended up doing a lot of interviews right off the bat. And the common denominator that I see from almost all the interviews that I've done so far is that, yes, there are a lot of worries, there are a lot of concerns, but with like innovative minded people like yourself, I'm definitely seeing this tendency to say, no, now is the time to actually invest in innovation. It's not the time to scale back. It was also something that I had thought a lot about, what's going to happen to all these startups and where are we going to go next? And also what are corporations going to do? And I'm seeing a lot of businesses, a lot of organizations saying, now is the perfect time to invest. Now is the perfect time to take a quick step back, look at what's going on and reevaluate, reshuffle, and then start moving forward. And this like common statement that keeps coming up and it keeps popping into my mind also when I'm listening to you. It's like, we're handed lemons, let's start making lemonade. And it's just like, it's a scary time, but for the same measure, it's almost also kind of like an exciting time, because like what you said, in the last recession, a lot of new businesses, came up that are now extremely successful. And I can see already right now that the organizations that are deciding to, move in the direction that what you're talking about will be the ones that actually are going to be, succeeding and are going to be very successful. So I think right now, that's why I think your work is extremely relevant and extremely important. And that's why I only highly recommend people read it. Also, of course, there are many great books, but I think we really need to put the focus on innovation and, like you say, be less zombie and really leverage the opportunities that are at stake. Because let's face it, if you are not investing into innovation right now, there might not be a future to invest into, period, right?
Absolutely. One of the things I'm, again, eternal optimist, hoping things are going to work out well. My suspicion is that most organizations at the moment are looking at themselves and looking at their future and thinking, we really need to organize better, whether that's just being more agile and having more innovation and whatever else. But we are not the organization that tomorrow needs. There has to be some change. And I'm really hopeful that that light will stay on long enough that real meaningful change, deep change work happens about how we go to market and what we go to market with. My concern, and what I'm saying to people at the moment, is use this as an opportunity to deeply reflect on how can we do our best work at a team level, at an individual level, and organizationally. Use this time while it's on the radar, because what I suspect is going to happen, who knows what's going to happen next, but I think people are desperate to get back to normality. And that will, unfortunately, I think, mean in many circumstances that ways of working will revert back to the way that they were. Now, I can't help but think there will be more remote work going on. But at the same time, the measures that we have in place that ultimately drive the whole thing, are they really going to change so that we pull more innovation in? I don't know. But here is a perfect opportunity to be thinking about that. My concern is that we'll allow ourselves to creep back into the old ways of working that put cement in layers of the organization that stop new ideas from growing. And I guess, I had a really interesting conference yesterday. It was a couple of hundred people, and I was doing a spiel about Be Less Zombie, and it was a really fun session. We had a cartoonist, did lots of good things. But at the end, the guy who runs the whole organization was making some very noble comments about innovation. And of course, we need to do more of this, and it's all about that. And with the best will in the world, I don't think anything will change because it's statements. There's no roadmap for, okay, so how are we going to make that transition? And I see this a lot. It's very easy for leaders to stand up and talk about what innovation looks like, and all we need to do is blah, and it will happen. No, it's not. Innovation is an argument with the status quo always. There's an image in the book of this huge sumo wrestler who's called Status Quo, and there's this tiny little skinny guy who's trying to beat him up, and he's called innovation. And that's the way it works. The metrics inside most organizations are geared entirely towards the optimization of today. And that means that anything that shows up that looks anything different from today has nowhere to go, nowhere to play. It's running for its life. Usually it's dead on arrival. It's really hard for anything different to emerge. And until leaders, I think, start to get hold of a different way of looking at how an organization needs to be structured so that innovation can show up, which does require different behaviors from them, we're always going to be in the same boat. And I guess that's another motivation for writing the book, trying to be really practical on, okay, so what would you do next? And the last chapter is called Day One. I had a call once with the senior vice president of a bank in Australia, and we had this really great call talking about innovation. And she said, okay, this is all great, but what do I do now? What's the next step? And I feel like that's what very many executives get stuck with, often because they've never actually been trained in what to do. They've been trained in running today brilliantly. They've never really had any deep training or experience in managing a more uncertain environment, which has to be the case if you're going to have more breakthrough innovation, which is what leaders tell me they want. So it's, chicken and egg, but I think it does have to start there.
You kind of answered my last question there, which was, what's your recommendation for management, mid-management, and upper management? So is it just taking that first step, just get going? What other advice, what's your number one advice that you have?
Well, there's two tracks on this for me. And again, I've been very clear on this in the book. There's the ideal world scenario, which is light bulbs go off in every leader's head simultaneously. And we say, okay, we are changing the way we think about how we go to market. We're going to build more innovation in. We're going to be strategic about, incremental stretch and exploratory innovation. We're going to resource it all well. And we're going to do what this book says, and lots of other books. And you start from an innovation strategy, which causes everything to fall into place. That's a longer term piece of work, but ultimately I think that's the right thing to do. Now, not everybody is up for that, because when you start to have that conversation, you lay out the roadmap of what's required, it can feel too hard. It's like, oh, really? Can't we just run a few more brainstorms? Can't we just buy some idea management software and we'll be fine? Maybe, probably not. So that the first is do the job well and start where you can, even if it's a 5% improvement, but be looking at 100% improvement and go on the journey. I think the reality inside most organizations is that there's limited appetite to go that far, even though I think it's the right thing to do from a stewardship point of view. What I've seen work really effectively lower down inside the organization is to teach teams how to do experimentation. So dream big, start small. And the reason why innovation has such a bad reputation, I think, inside so many organizations is that you have a lot of failure. People hate the failure. So if people hate the failure, what do they hate the failure of? Well, it's the pain that comes from the failure. It's the stakes feel too high. Okay, so let's lower the stakes. How do we lower the stakes so that people feel safer to step into more innovation? And all of the work that Eric Ries has done and Alex Osterwalder and many others around lean experimentation, I've seen that. I wouldn't say it's the silver bullet, but if there's one thing that you could turn on that would suddenly activate innovation and suddenly give executives more confidence that we can innovate because the stakes are now lower, I think it's a really big deal. So basic principle is, I have an idea. Before I spend a penny on that idea, I need to understand deeply, what assumptions do I have in my mind about what needs to be true for that idea to be working out in the wild. I test those assumptions as quickly and as cheaply as I can. And then I have some data that I can take to my boss and say, I think we should take this to the next level. And it's pay as you go learning. So the stakes are really low to begin with. I mean, if you can equip people to run tiny experiments that cost nothing and are really fast, why wouldn't you do that? And what I've seen inside organizations who have turned this on is this gradual sort of peeping over other people's offices and so, what are you doing over there? And managers suddenly starting to feel confident that, wait, you did that with no money in that time. It gives a greater sense of confidence that those scary ideas out there that we don't feel that we can pursue because they're too risky, suddenly if we shrink down the first step and the next step is only this big and the next step is only this big, suddenly it's more palatable. Suddenly it's something that we feel that we're not going to get fired over, or any of the other multitude of reasons that we step away from doing the right thing are suddenly more accessible. So as a guerrilla tactic, a first step I often say to teams is, buy the Lean Startup, buy my book, buy Alex Osterwalder's book, buy a book that teaches you how to do lean experimentation, start doing it and watch what happens, and be your own experiment as a team and learn how to navigate through the organization with that. I've just found it's a very fast way to get executive attention, and they go, oh my goodness, we could all be doing this. And then hopefully that starts to unlock a more strategic conversation about, well, do you know what, how we could join this up? We could be running much faster, be doing much more bold innovation, but you've got to start somewhere that gives them confidence.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more. And, again, I think it's extremely essential to get into, your book, all the books that you mentioned, Eric Ries, Alex Osterwalder. There's so many amazing books that have been written and will, continue to come out from, from these great authors. And I strongly believe it's all about taking that first step forward. It's all about trying. It's all about accepting failure. I heard you say that a couple of times, accepting failure into your life, because it's just part of being human. And you and I are definitely aligned also on the design thinking front, from what I hear from you, because that's a big mantra of mine. It's like really understanding the hypothesis, understanding the problem, understanding who has the problem, and many different steps before you start going into the traditional way of just developing a solution, and really building that foundation layer upon which you can then create so many great products and services. And I agree with you. I've seen it so many times that teams that used to go the old way, the old track of development, now all of a sudden with all these tools that are coming out, you can essentially, build something or learn something in no time. And, adding to the point that you were saying earlier, just talking to your customer and gathering insights, it takes half an hour or an hour, maybe a week's work. It's nothing compared to the amount of work that's being used usually to develop entire products or services. And you can just take that and present it. And, I always say that the client's voice is definitely the strongest when it comes to making any sort of argumentation for any project.
Yeah, definitely. There's two things that I've started to really emphasize with executives, well, and managers as well, trying to influence their managers around how to do more innovation, more risky innovation. And it's lower the risk, lower the stakes. So how do you lower the risk? Well, you look at what progress. So this is called jobs to be done thinking. You look at the progress that a customer is trying to make in any particular context. You look back over history. How long have they been trying to make the same process, but different technology has come and allowed them to do it better? You play it forward, you can start to think more agnostically about the technology that you may need to bring, which stops you falling into that innovator's dilemma so easily, which is, we make this really well, we make this really fast, and you're stuck in incrementalism, which isn't sufficient. So there's lowering, and I think the more that you can decode what that progress is, and again, it's something that we talk about in the book, it's the way that Netflix thinks. You know, Netflix started it with DVDs. Their founding philosophy was, we exist to help people find great movies. There's no mention of how, there's no mention of technology. They went from DVDs to streaming because they're in pursuit of helping people find better movies in the best possible way, given the technology that's currently available. That's a really healthy way to think about how we go to market and what we take to market. And we're continually holding it tightly but loosely at the same time, if you know what I mean. So it's lower the risk and then lower the stakes with experimentation. And I think that, again, it's just a smart way of approaching an innovation strategy.
Absolutely. Elvin, thank you so much for your time today. I really, again, appreciate it. You gave so much valuable input. As a little thank you, I'll give away 3 copies of your book, Be Less Zombie. I think it's, you have a powerful message, and I would like to do my small part to help you spread it. So what I will do is I'll post this interview and I'll ask a question, and the first 3 people to ask that question correctly will win one of your books. And I, for a closing statement, very much hope that you and I get to meet next time you're in Zurich.
Yes.
And you told me before the call that you discovered this one place, so I hope you will show it to me once you come here.
Yeah, best spaghetti bolognese I've ever eaten was in Zurich. We need to go back to find that place.
I will help you find it. All right, Elvin. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.
Yes, likewise, Alessandro. Thank you. Cheerio.